Good afternoon, everybody. We are missing some folks because it's Yom Kippur. And so a number of people that would normally come, I know, are doing that. Next time we have a video on Africa, South Africa. And after that, we're going to be taking a serious look at Moldova. So we are so delighted to have Resat Kasaba come back to us after several years of absence. He has been here before. Everybody loved his talk, so we're so glad to have him back. For those of you that are not familiar with him, Resat is an expert in the history and politics of Middle East and has taught undergraduate and graduate students at the UW for over 30 years. He is a recipient of the UW Distinguished Teaching Award. His courses cover a wide range of topics, including economic history, state-society relations, migration, ethnicity, nationalism, urban history, and Middle East, U.S. foreign policy, and world history. Kasaba served as the director of Jackson School for 10 years, and he was director of Jackson School when we had him here last time. He is currently researching history in U.S. foreign policy in Turkey and the political consequences of rural-urban divide in modern Turkey. I think you will find this gentleman well equipped to give us a good lecture. Thank you so much, Resat.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come to Horizon House, and I'm especially happy that after the pandemic, we're able to be in the same room together, and I get to see some of my old friends also. So this is a real source of pleasure for me. Thank you very much. So what I thought I would do in the time that I have is to, most of the time I will talk about the Middle East in general, just to talk about some things that are happening there and how they're likely to influence events in the coming years. So I think, like many other regions in the world, Middle East also seems to be going through a particularly intense period of transformation. So I'll just touch on some themes there, and then at the end I will say a few things about Turkey, a country that is dear to my heart. There's a lot to talk about there, but I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have about the Middle East in general, and also about Turkey. So what are the issues that I think we need to pay attention to make sense of some of what's happening in recent years? So I have these points here, and these will be the topics, main topics of my this discussion. Just to go over them quickly now, I will say a few things about what I call authoritarian consolidation, which means diminishing hope for democracy to take root in many of the countries in the Middle East. So we have a series of people who are referred to as strong men. They're always men. And they seem to be really intent on doing away with civil society organizations, political parties, press, and things of that sort. And this seems to be now pretty much common across the region, authoritarian consolidation. The other thing I think we should keep in mind a little bit is the decline of U.S. influence. And this is very noticeable for those of us who go there, those of us who read what's happening. especially after the Iraq War. The prestige and the influence in the region has been steadily declining. So that is another issue, that topic I'll say a few things about. And the other side of this, of course, is the rising influence of China. Both economically and diplomatically, China is becoming a significant partner in trade and also very heavily centrally involved in the diplomacy of the region. So I'll say a few things about what this means and how we should think about it. Now, these are the main things then: the authoritarianism and declining US influence and China's influence. And internally, there are a number of topics that I think we need to pay attention to understand the Middle East. One is the underlying economic problems. Now, if you set aside the few countries that are blessed with oil, which generates a lot of wealth and provides the citizens of those countries a comfortable life, but those countries, of course, are all countries that have very small populations. So most of the people who live in the Middle East actually live in countries that have these problems of income inequality, growing poverty, high debt. So economically, it is a region where many of these countries are not doing very well. One result of this is the status of groups of people in these countries that now we need to keep in mind, because what happens to them and what's likely to happen to them and what they're likely to do, I think will have some impact on how the region changes. And especially there is the youth. The Middle East, across the region, you are talking about a region where something like 3/4 of the people are 30 years or younger. They're a very young population. So the youth, what they do, how they see their future, will have a very important role to play. Women is obviously a very important source of discontent in places like Iran, but their status is something we should keep talking about. And there are minorities, and when I say minorities, both minorities in different countries, countries that are dominated one brand of Islam may have a significant minority of Shia, etc. Ethnic minorities, these are especially the status of Kurds in Turkey, in Syria, in Iran, and in Iraq. And also the same lines, of course, the status of Palestinians in Israel. And as a result of these long-term wars in places like Yemen and Syria, we also have a significant number of refugees. These are people who are internally displaced. That is, in Syria, for example, they're still within Syria, but displaced from their homes, but also they are refugees in other countries. So that is the other economic and social challenges are those. And I will end by talking about the future. And the future, I think the theme really we need to keep in mind, especially in terms of foreign policy, is this growing reality of multilateralism. So it's becoming very hard. That's true not only in the Middle East, but in regions like Middle East. The reality is becoming more of these changing partnerships depending on the issue at hand, and no longer is it possible to talk about US allies as opposed to, let's say, Russian allies, etc. So those are the bullet points, and I will just say very briefly something about each one of them, and then hopefully we can have some time for question and discussion. So first of all, when I say authoritarian consolidation, I have two maps here. One of them that is to our right is the Middle East, and the other is the world. This map is part of The Economist magazine, has these periodic reports on democracy in the world, and they kind of color the countries in terms of how much democracy there is in them. And they have ways of measuring this, like elections, rule of law, etc., free courts, judiciary, separation of powers, whatever. And the darkest sort of maroon, darkest red-brown areas are places where little to no democracy exists, and the dark green areas are considered to be close to full democracies. So, of course, what is immediately apparent in this map is that most of the Middle East is full of countries that fall on the authoritarian regime scale. There are some hybrid regimes, but they're also sliding in the wrong direction. Turkey is one of them. And Tunisia is marked also a hybrid, but that has since become, and this is from less than 2 years ago, but since then Tunisia has also become a very authoritarian one-man regime here. So when you look at the map, the only country that is marked as being semi-democratic is Israel, but of course there too, there are all kinds of issues that have to do with Palestinians, but nevertheless, in terms of practice of democracy, that is one. But there too, if you think about in the last year, there has been this move towards limiting the power of courts and giving more power to the executive branch, and huge demonstrations have taken place. So even Israel is sort of in the margins in some of these measures. So that is the reality. So we have a country, a geography that has almost 300 million people that extend from the Atlantic Ocean to all the way to Central Asia. And it is full of countries that are ruled by authoritarian rulers. Now, you will remember that if we went back 10 years ago, 2010, 2011, things looked very different. Those were the years when demonstrations were taking place all across this place, in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, in Bahrain, in Syria. Demonstrations were taking place to bring about more participation in the government, to open up the regimes, to bring democracy. And we were all observers of the Middle East, people who live in the Middle East, people who care about the Middle East. We were extremely hopeful that this was a very important transformation that was taking place. And it was referred to as the Arab Spring, that is spring sort of looking up forward to better things to come. But of course what happened is that after a very brief period of hope and excitement, things turned around. And right now, all the countries that went through that kind of transformation and during the Arab Spring, they are all either mired in civil war or they are ruled by people who are even more authoritarian than the ones that came before. So why this happened is, of course, a very big question. But one way of thinking about this actually is, first of all, there were internal reasons. So groups within these countries reacted to these changes to protect their own interests. But I think more importantly, conservative powers in the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, became very concerned about these changes, and they actively financed groups who ended up being really very effective in overturning whatever democracy that was developing in the area. So this is, so today now, 2023, when we look at the region, not only we have these regimes that are authoritarian, but none of them seem to have any kind of hope or movement towards a democratic future. So that is the one kind of reality of the region, the contemporary Middle East, we should keep in mind. Now, this is actually related to something that's happening globally, and that is the rise of China as a major economic power in the world, but also increasingly a major player in the diplomacy of regions like the Middle East. Now, China is related to the discussion about authoritarian consolidation because unlike the United States or European Union, China, when it enters into economic or political deals with countries, China doesn't talk about human rights, doesn't talk about democracy. It doesn't make that a precondition for entering into these relationships. So for the regimes in the Middle East, it is a better partner for that reason. So that is one relationship between authoritarianism and China that we should keep in mind. But China's influence really is big. It's growing very fast, and there are various aspects to it. One of them is this One Belt, One Road initiative. This is something that the Chinese leader started in 2013, so almost 10 years ago. He made a speech about this plan to build both through the oceans and also over land, this network of highways, railways, and ports that would connect Asia with Europe and China with Europe and Africa. Now, at the time, people didn't pay much attention to it. It looked like a good plan, you know, building roads, etc. But of course, over time, it became clear that this was also a way for China to spread its influence across this area, a large area. This happened in 2013, and it is very much in the background of China's global kind of power now, not only in the Middle East, but as you can see, in other parts, and especially in Africa. So that is one aspect of growing the presence of China in the area. So the other is China's role is also economic. We don't really always think about that or don't hear it in these terms, but when you look at this chart, these two graphs, what this shows is that China is now a leading trading partner in almost all the Middle Eastern countries. And it is both imports and exports, and of course in some countries exports has to do with oil, but not all of them. It is big. So they are a very big player economically, and the ones that are marked green shows you that China is the #1 import and export partner. So for countries like UAE and Saudi Arabia, China is not only a major partner, is the biggest number one partner. So economically, it has a very big presence now, China has. Now the rise of China's influence in the Middle East contrasts with the declining power and influence of the United States. And this graph shows you very clearly that one is going up and the other is barely staying steady or going down. And the change from the turn of the 21st century to now is significant. Now, decline of the United States influence in the Middle East. So the economic part of the story is a big question. It has to be discussed in relationship to not only the Middle East, but other parts of the world, and also, of course, domestic economic and political problems in the United States. So I'm not going to go into that here, but what I want to talk about is the declining influence and prestige of the United States in the Middle East itself. Now, there are different reasons for this. There are different ways of thinking about this. But to me, the most important factor that has led to this is the war in Iraq. You will, I'm sure, remember in 2003, 20 years ago, the United States invaded Iraq, and which turned out that this invasion was done on false premises, that Iraq was building weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, and it turned out that there wasn't anything like that. And not only that, but the war quickly turned into a big quagmire, a big mess, and something like 5,000 Americans were killed, but the number of Iraqis, civilians who were killed during this war is not known. Nobody counted them. Best estimates are somewhere between 100 to 200,000 people. So this was done in a way that had no really clear justification. So it was the first war that the U.S. fought as a preemptive war. So there was the U.S. was not attacked by Iraq. Iraq was not involved in 9/11, but it was done for political reasons, and it was done, like I said, a preemptive attack. And it turned out so bad, and it turned out so destructive for Iraq, which is a very important Arab country right at the center of the Middle East, that for people in the Middle East, it is very hard for them to accept that this was an honest mistake. So for them, this was done deliberately. This was done really to destroy this Arab country, and to dominate and control the Middle East. And once it didn't work out, and once the U.S. was forced to withdraw after like 6-7 years with nothing to show for it, it is now very hard for the United States to be really convincing when it talks about democracy, when it talks about human rights, when it talks about all those positive things that usually comes along with U.S. involvement in different regions. So what happened? I mean, that came, of course, the Iraq War came right, after the end of the Cold War, but the Iraq War left behind a huge gap. It was a vacuum. There was no superpower, and China's influence is growing, but China is not as powerful as the U.S., It's not in a position to play the kind of role that the US does. But what happened is that in the Middle East there was this vacuum. And as you know, that vacuum was filled with things like Islamic State, ISIS, and increasingly, as I will come later, some regional powers like Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia are trying to fill in that gap and play a more important, and Russia role in the region. So the U.S. is declining, and U.S. is nowhere as powerful as it was in the past, and we have this vacuum in the region, and that vacuum is being filled by regional powers, but also economically, China is becoming a big player in the Middle East. Now, China's role is not limited to economics. China seems to be also interested in playing a diplomatic role in the region. And it is playing the role that the US used to play, which is bringing in antagonistic parties and trying to find something common and then foster some peace, some understanding, and some progress in that way. One of the most significant initiatives in that respect is the agreement that they kind of acted as intermediary for between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Why is this important? This is important because these are two major rivals in the region, one representing the Shia sect, the Sunnis, leader of Sunnis, but of course a very wealthy and powerful country that has all kinds of ambitions, and I'll talk about them in a little bit, and Iran. As far as the US is concerned, of course, is a pariah. Nobody needs to talk to Iran, has to be excluded, isolated, sanctioned because of everything that they're doing in different parts of the region. That is the US attitude, but China now is able to come in and then bring these two together. And this can't be bad for the region, of course, to have these two major, powerful antagonists agreeing to exchange ambassadors and reestablish relations is very, very significant. So it is not, so this is really a very good example of, and of course you have to keep in mind that Saudi Arabia still is one of the closest allies of the United States in the Middle East. So for Saudi Arabia to do this also shows that the US influence is not as big, as high as it used to be. Not only that, just last week, the Chinese government, the president, also hosted the president of Syria in China, Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad has been waging a war against his own people for over 10 years now, since the beginning of the Arab Spring. He bombed his own people, used chemical weapons. Half of his country is totally destroyed. And he is, for the European Union, for the United States, is someone that really should be shunned, right? Not included in anything. But for China now, this is also another statement of their independent kind of vision of these regions, and a reflection of their attitude that whatever happens within a country is not really their concern, and for their own reasons, not only they host him with red carpet and then received by the president himself, and it's also, I think, quite remarkable that this is happening. So this is then the big picture in terms of the declining U.S. influence and rising the China's presence, and also the internal sort of this authoritarian regimes that are becoming more common, and also people like Bashar al-Assad it looks like they're not going anywhere. So I want to say now a few things about the underlying tensions. What is happening in the region socially and economically? Middle East, of all the regions that you can think about, is one of the most unequal. So inequality in the Middle East is really very, very pronounced. Bottom 50%, what this shows you is what percentage of the wealth, the bottom 50%, so the poorest part of the country, what percentage of the wealth that they have. So in the Middle East, it's over 20%. In Western Europe. In the Middle East, it is barely, not even 10%. Okay? Whereas top 10%, the wealthiest people, and you can see places like South Africa and Middle East and Brazil and India, some of the poorest countries are, they have a very, very large portion of national wealth. 60%, more than 60%. So this is really the gap in between that shows you this inequality that really creates the huge tension in the society. And also this happens, we know that the United States also has problems in terms of inequality, but this is also a region where there is little to no safety net. Social programs are very they barely exist, except of course those countries that have oil, that they're able to distribute money to their citizens. But remember, it's really a very small minority of the region as a whole. So if you're poor in the Middle East, you have to rely on your own family, on your own networks. You can't really rely on the state to take care of you. So that is really, the inequality is bad, and it is also getting worse over time. So that is one underlying tension that is going to be very important for the future of the region. Now, the other side of this is youth unemployment. I told you that youth is really, this is a very young region in terms of age. All across the country, you have a tremendous number of young people, and you can see that youth unemployment in some of these countries is very bad. Palestine, over 40%, Saudi Arabia, it's just all across. Right? And the Middle East as a whole, you are talking about 30%. So 1 out of 3 young people have no jobs. And one reflection of this is, it's true even for countries like Turkey, but all across this region, anybody who has any kind of skill, medical, technical, what have you, that they can market overseas, are trying to leave. Not only we're talking about unemployment, but we're also talking about the future of these countries where they will not have enough people to build the new industries, create new industries and jobs, whatever. So that is unemployment, and especially youth unemployment is key, and also the growing inequality in income distribution. So things like this, of course, the pressure of poverty, pressure of lack of opportunities always creates tension. And these tensions come out in unexpected times, in unexpected ways, in different parts. So Arab Spring was one example of this. people just went out on the streets and started demanding. In Egypt in 2011, their slogan was they want bread, they want jobs. Those were the things that they were really demonstrating for. So something like that happened. I just want to show you this Egypt before we move on. Egypt, of course, is a very big, one of the biggest, most important countries in the Middle East. But here again, you can see, let's say, per person gross domestic product. As you can see, its growth was even negative for a while, right? Prices are going up very fast. Government deficit is huge, and youth unemployment rate in Egypt is almost 45%. So this is one cross-section of an important country that emphasizes the difficulties. So one way in which these tensions manifest themselves is people start demonstrating. And in Iran last year, there were widespread demonstrations led by women who wanted more freedom in terms of how they dressed and what they did, how they lived their lives. And they really put their own lives in danger by going out on the streets and demonstrating. And they had this symbol, women, life, freedom. And for a while, it looked like they were going to be successful. There was a lot of hope. But what happened is that the government was able to clamp down on this in a very serious way. And now, just 1 year after these demonstrations, not only we have no more demonstrations, just this week, Iranian government passed even a more restrictive laws regulating women's headscarf and their kind of employment and their status in schools. There's much more authoritarian regimes that were imposed. Now, the thing, of course, is that just like in many countries, Egypt, Iran, as the government becomes more oppressive, the underlying tensions tend to grow worse and worse. In Iran, inflation is like 47%, and then it is unclear how long they can control it and how they're going to control it. So that is really underlying economic tensions and women I wanted to emphasize. And the other is the refugees. Refugees, of course, is a big issue everywhere. In the US, in Europe, everywhere people are talking about this, and people are really worried about all these displaced people coming in. But I want to show you that how most of the Syrian refugees actually are in the Middle East. Most of them are in the Middle East. 95% of Syrian refugees are in the Middle East. Only 5% managed to go to Europe and other parts of the world. So they are in the Middle East, and in countries like Turkey, we're talking about more than 3.6 million refugees. There's the largest number of refugees in any country in the world. They are in Turkey. And Jordan, 2.9 million, Lebanon, 1.4 million. So presence of these refugees in these countries are another source of pressure in the politics and economics of the Middle Eastern countries. They don't have the resources to accommodate these large numbers of people, and that creates all kinds of issues, and like anywhere else in the world. In Turkey, too, now we have a very conservative politician who has made the Syrian refugees the biggest issue in his political propaganda, etc. So as economic conditions get bad, inflation, unemployment, presence of these very large number of refugees becomes an issue. So that is the other issue. And just minorities, unsettled status of people like Palestinians. Again, most of them are in the Middle East itself, and their status is unclear in all these countries because they are considered Palestinians and they're considered temporary residents. So there's always this hope that they will go back, which of course is very unlikely in the reality of the things. But their presence in these countries is another issue that everybody is talking about. And Kurds are similarly a group of people who don't have a state, and they are threatening the stability of the countries that they are living. In Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, in Turkey, you have Kurdish activism that has various demands, different demands of regional autonomy, independence, political rights, and the clash between Kurds and Turks and Kurds and Arabs is a reality of political life all across the region, and that's something that has to be kept in mind. So this is the kind of, if you go back, and this is the broad sort of picture, US and China, and underlying pressures, underlying issues that are likely to be very important in the coming years. Months and years. So if we go back and then again look at the region as a whole and then see what is happening, how we can describe what is happening. One reality of the Middle East as a whole now is something called multilateralism is becoming more and more of a defining feature of the region. This is very different. In the Cold War, Middle East was divided very clearly between the US and Soviet spheres of influence. After the end of the Cold War, for a while, it was the United States that was really the biggest power, and then they blew it up with the Iraq War, and there was this uncertain period with ISIS and all the problems that came with it. But now we are seeing this kind of states in the Middle East interacting with each other, not on a permanent basis. What do I mean by this? They ally with Russia in some things, it's United States sometimes, they come together, they move apart, China, depending on the issue. We have a much more fluid kind of environment. We have to, I mean, despite all the problems, all the conflicts, all the dying and killing that happens in the Middle East, one thing we have to appreciate right now in 2023 is there is a relative de-escalation in international conflict. That is something we should really keep in mind, and it is important to keep in mind. It is important, for example, that the civil war in Yemen ended. It was one of the most destructive conflicts in the Middle East. It lasted a long time. Saudis and Iranians are talking to each other. They have ambassadors, so that is a very important source of tension. Right? There was conflict between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, between Turkey and Egypt, between Turkey and Qatar were allied, but the two of them were kind of not in good terms with us. That is changing also. All these countries are now talking to each other. Israel's agreement with some of the Arab states is very significant. It's not like Israel was not at war with any of these countries, but it is important that there is now investment, there is tourism, there is kind of back and forth, and that really makes way for a different kind of Middle East. And it looks like they are going to have some kind of a deal with Saudi Arabia soon. So this is really a de-escalation that we need to kind of appreciate. And then in that context, we have the rise of these regional powers, especially Saudi Arabia and Turkey, that are becoming more prominent as power brokers, as dealing with different powers. So this is the Abraham Accords 2020 between US, UAE, and Bahrain. So these are examples of Saudi Arabia, for example, dealing with different major powers and events and having a role to play. Here he is, the crown prince, with Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Here he is with president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and bottom is with Bashar al-Assad. So the whole scheme of things, of course, these two countries were on very bad terms until recently. Some of you will remember an American journalist was actually murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and that was never really properly investigated, and all signs were that the government had something to do with it. But all that is now forgotten, and the two are really cooperating on a number of issues. Bashar al-Assad, after being really a persona non grata for a long time, now is brought back into the Arab fold, and Saudi Arabia plays an important role. And then the war with Ukraine, Russia war, that again is significant because Russia is an important trading partner of Saudi Arabia. So this is one of these powers. Now the other power, regional power that is really becoming a broker of some sorts is Turkey. Turkey, there are two sides to this. Recep Tayyip Erdogan just won re-election just this year for another 5 years. At the end of those 5 years, he will have been the president, prime minister or president of Turkey for a quarter of a century, 25 years. So the longest serving leader of Turkey, and he has been the most consequential since Atatürk of leader of Turkey, and he is. Even though there are all kinds of issues that have to do with press, they have to do freedoms, they have to do all kinds of things, but the elections that were held this past spring, by and large, were fair elections, and they do reflect that he has a significant source of power and support in the country. So his position in the country is now safe, especially with these elections, and he uses his involvement in regional issues as a way of improving his image and his power domestically. So he presents himself as a power broker, as a peacemaker, so he can talk to Abbas, the leader of the Palestinians, but also the Prime Minister of Israel, with Putin, and also with Zelensky, and of course with Biden. So that is really, as we move forward, it is very likely, the Crown Prince Saudi Mohammed bin Salman will be there for the foreseeable future. He's not even 40 yet. And Erdogan has just won election for another 5 years. And transition beyond Erdogan is very uncertain. Nobody really knows what's likely to happen. But in that sense, these strong leaders, one thing that they give to their people is a promise of stability. And after the ISIS, after the Iraq war, after seeing what happened in Syria or in Yemen, for people in the Middle East, that is something that a lot of people value. So they seem to be more than willing to go along with what's happening in the big picture, in the big politics, as long as they are kind of protected by these strong leaders and they can kind of live without being afraid of what's likely to happen. So just one side of this, of course, is, and I'm going to end here, see if you have questions. When elections happened in May, a lot of us thought that Erdogan was likely to lose because the economy was very bad. Their inflation in Turkey is something like 70-80%, 70%. There was this huge earthquake. Well, earthquake is a natural disaster, but the government appeared to be totally incompetent in dealing with the aftermath. So a lot of us thought that this would be really the end of it, but nevertheless, he managed to get reelected, and he managed to get reelected as presenting himself as the only person who's capable of dealing with these problems, solving the economic problem, rebuilding the country, and again, being in power for 20 years means that a very large part of young people in Turkey have only known him as the leader. They have never seen anyone else. That's all they know, and that really, really projects, I think, a certain degree of stability. So it's not a for the region itself, the thing that bothers me most is something I mentioned in passing, and that is losing young people. Young people who could conceivably do things, change things, are looking to leave. They don't see any future for themselves in Iran, in Turkey, in Egypt, in Lebanon, or whatever. So that is I think the major source of concern for me as we move forward. So I think I'm going to stop here and see if you have any questions. Anything that's not clear, I'm happy to expand.
Thank you so much, Resat. We're waiting to get some mics going here. Who said they were going to? You have a mic?
Can you speak more about the refugees and the cause of their suffering?
Yes, the refugees, for the Middle East, the major, most of them are Syrians. You also have a fairly large number of Afghan refugees, but a lot of them are Syrians. And it is, their suffering has a lot of dimensions to it. First of all, a lot of them come to Turkey. A lot of them actually hope that they will use Turkey as a way station to go to Europe and beyond. But what has happened is that the European Union signed an agreement with Turkey where Turkey is receiving 3 billion euros over 3 years, basically to keep the Syrians in Turkey, to prevent them from going. And when they are kept in Turkey, Turkey does not really have a system. Despite all the problems, of course, in the US, you have a way of seeking asylum, applying for asylum. There's a whole Department of Homeland Security that deals with this. Turkey doesn't really have that kind of infrastructure. So what happens is that these 3.6 million people, many of them are young, have no protection. So they're not in camps. There are no camps in Turkey except for one that has maybe less than 500,000 people in it. So most of them are out in the cities. So if you go to Istanbul and Ankara now, you see Syrians begging, collecting garbage, whatever, so they're very visible, but they're also exploited. Child labor, employment in sweatshops, they have no way of seeking any rights, no way of protesting. So they generate a lot of profits and wealth for people who abuse them, but they themselves are stuck. And many of them actually are refugees because it's impossible for them to go back to Syria. It's not just because they leave because they don't have jobs. They are pushed out because of their identity or ethnicity, whatever. Any problem, any issue that have to do with refugees has this human dimension, and I think that is really the major thing.
Could I ask a question about one of the details? We very much appreciate this presentation. It's been very, very helpful. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
One of the details that I didn't quite catch is youth unemployment. Is there some way to explain why it's so high in this region?
Yes. A couple of things. I think one is that after most of these countries became countries after World War II. I mean, they became independent. And shortly after that, of course, I mean, when they started, these are mostly poor places, no kind of proper kind of healthcare, whatever. But that changed very quickly. So things like infant mortality, pre-birth, prenatal care, those kinds of things improved. So the birth rates went up in many of these countries significantly. But none of these countries, even the wealthier ones like Turkey, did not have either the educational system or the kinds of institutions to really take care of these young people, to train them in ways that they could be productive. So that is one part of it. The other is these countries are not really, they didn't grow fast enough. They're not growing fast enough to generate the kind of jobs that a young population like that needs. Now, the birth control is sometimes shunned, and it's not something that is really people are advocate very prominently. But despite that, Iran has become one of the more successful countries in reducing the birth rate. They really took that as an issue, and they did quite well. So those are a combination of things. And in Turkey, something else that Erdogan's regime did in the last 20 years is that they decided to open universities all across the country. So there are universities all across Turkey, but they're little better than high schools. They don't have the labs, they don't have the libraries, they don't have the infrastructure. So, but people graduate with BAs, which they can't do anything with.
I would appreciate it if you could say a little more about the current situation of the Kurds. I had the impression that some of Erdogan's predecessors were better disposed to the Kurds than he is.
Yeah.
But what has changed recently?
Yeah. Well, Kurds in Turkey, the question has to do with the status of Kurds in Turkey, especially with Erdogan. Actually, I mean, Erdogan himself, when he first came to power, he appeared to be a lot more liberal than he turned out to be. He thought at the time that he could really get the Kurds also on his side. And he had a period when he had this opening to the Kurds, bringing them into the political fold, but then he quickly changed his mind and moved away. Now, the thing with Kurds, of course, is a big issue, but to me, one way of thinking about it is that Kurds themselves have all kinds of demands in Turkey. Some want independence, some want cultural autonomy, some want something else. So there isn't really one unified Kurdish demand. So to deal with this properly, they have to be at the table. So what has happened instead is that governments in Turkey tried to come up with solutions and impose those on Kurds. And that, of course, sometimes some people among Kurds may go along with them, but for many of them, it doesn't really include their own views and visions. So they're always left in this precarious situation. So that is one part of it. And the other is, I don't really know if you could have a solution to the Kurdish problem, because most of the Kurds actually in Turkey live in Istanbul and other parts of the country, and they are fully integrated in Turkish life, and they can do, you know, all kinds of things. They're not discriminated against because they're Kurds. They are discriminated against if they express some demand for autonomy or independence. Then it becomes a political issue. So Erdogan basically, one way of thinking about it is that he's using some Kurds against other Kurds, and then just keeping it kind of, because it is a very, just like his, you know, success internationally, going after Kurds gets him votes because it makes him look like he's a Turkish nationalist. So when things get kind of tough for him, he oftentimes invents some reason to send some troops into northern Iraq and bomb some Kurdish areas, and then that becomes for him one of way of getting votes in Turkey itself. So that is where we are now. Sure. Thank you.
Do you feel?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was really shocked with the recent earthquake in Istanbul, and I haven't been able to contact my friend Lale, and she lives on the outskirts of Istanbul, and that I wonder about the effects of the earthquake.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Now
the recent earthquake.
what's happening?
The recent earthquake didn't really affect Istanbul. It was more centered in southern Turkey, so so I'm sure she's fine. But where it was very destructive, really. It is, we don't even know how many people were killed. I mean, like, at least officially they say 50,000, but it's probably more than that. A number of cities are completely destroyed. So, so it was very, very bad.
I'm concerned because I haven't gotten in contact with her.
Yeah,
I can't.
I think she's.
And I used to call her on the telephone, and we'd talk on the
Yeah.
telephone. You have to consider the hours.
Yeah. So is it.
But anyway,
Do you feel that Erdogan is sufficiently competent to improve the domestic situation in Turkey? Do you feel that that Erdogan is competent to improve the domestic situation in his next term, this term?
Yeah. I said no, but that's. But it is. But I have to say that he is an extremely skillful politician. Right. No matter what you do, Turkey is a big and complicated society. It takes a lot of political skill to get ahead and to stay on top. So, so that is his biggest asset. So, for example, when he realized that things were really bad after the elections, he went ahead and appointed a woman as the head of Turkish Central Bank. And she is in her either late 30s or early 40s. Has a PhD in some kind of industrial engineering from Princeton, and then got a degree in business, again from Princeton. Was a CEO of a number of companies in the United States, including a very high-ranking position in Goldman Sachs. So he brought her and made her the first woman head of central bank, and she seems to be doing the things that are necessary to put the Turkish economy in order. Now the question is, will he let her do her job, or for political reasons will he interfere? We don't know. So he's able to do things like that. But in the long term, one of the things that I find very problematic with him is that he's personally a very, how do I say this, vengeful person. There are certain, when he wants to go after someone, he really goes after someone. He is a leader, a civil society leader, a very prominent man, and very wealthy too, has been in jail now for 6 years without really any charges, real charges, because he really somehow doesn't like him, you know, and he's able to do that. So, so I don't have confidence in him putting everything in order, but I also would caution people against taking him really lightly. I think he has to be taken very seriously.
Thank you.
Sure. I think there are two. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, we have a kind of a warm association with Turkey.
I do too.
We've been there
Yeah.
3 times, and the first time was over some months, largely through Bill and Anna Edmonds, who lived on Bainbridge Island, and he was head of Red House Press, which was the first printing press in Turkey around 1900 or something like that, specializing in children's books and dictionaries and geographies. And they certainly were ambassadors for the United States. We traveled with them every place we went. They were embraced, and so were we, because we knew them. And it's just a nice aspect of that that most people don't actually realize that for 100 years we've had that
I
there.
don't think I knew that they were there. Red House is very well known in Turkey.
Yeah,
And its
right.
story is very interesting, actually. It goes back to mid-19th century.
Yeah,
Some Red House jumped ship as they were going through Istanbul, and then they just stayed there. And so for, you know, like you say, most Turkish households still have a Red House dictionary.
That's amazing.
English, Turkish, and then not only that, dictionaries that go back from the 19th century, etc. So that was a big, and then the printing house was very important.
Well, it's nice that we have this whole local connection. You know, they lived on Bainbridge Island.
Yeah.
I'm curious whether any of these Muslim countries care about the Uyghurs in China.
Yes.
Do they simply not mention it?
Yes. Good question. The Uyghurs in China and their what's happening to them. So that's a very good example of Erdogan's political maneuvering. So initially he was all over this, Muslim brothers, you know. But when it turned out that he had to maintain good relations with China, he completely forgot about it. And I think, unfortunately, I think it is true for all these other countries too. It's a very sad kind of situation. But Erdogan really was out there, like the leader of Muslims in the world, etc. But they told him, just be quiet. Yeah. Yes.
Based on the excellent presentation you've been
Thank you.
making about current conditions,
Thank you.
I'd like you to think ahead 10 years and tell me where you think the Middle East is going to look like, or what it's going to look like.
Yeah. So 10 years, what is the Middle East going to look like? Will you invite me back in 10 years and hold me to it? You know, I don't, I mean, if you look what I ended up with, I don't expect, I mean, no matter what happens with the US elections, I don't really think the US will change its course in a major way. So, which means it's not going to become more involved, it's not going to become less involved, it'll just be there as a factor. I think that will continue. I think no matter how you look at it, the war in Ukraine diminished Putin's power. It doesn't have the kind of military and resources to do all these things. Maybe some of you followed this little war that happened in Armenia. He just couldn't intervene. It's right there. Armenia was an ally of Russia, but he couldn't do anything. So it's not going to be. So I think China is still will continue to be important, But China's importance, I think, still, I think, more economic than diplomatic. I think China still, I mean, they have some ideological visions about China itself, about Hong Kong, about Taiwan, but in places like Africa, Middle East, etc., their main interest is economic. So I don't see them as becoming really big, sort of replacing. So which means that the regional powers, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, if Israel finds a way of enacting some agreement with Saudi Arabia, that'll be very important. So I think we will see this fluid kind of relations going back and forth, but fundamentally we may see more of an economic integration in the region that we haven't seen ever in the modern era. So I think that is part of what I would think, but we're always surprised by the Middle East too, I think. Is there one more?
Further questions?
Speaking of the declining U.S.,
Yes.
what about the Fulbright program in Turkey? It's the earliest and largest American Fulbright program. Is it still going
Yeah.
strong?
It's still going. It is still going, and it has always been one of the few countries, I think one of the few countries that actually have its local Fulbright commission, so which means that they have the final say in who comes and who doesn't come. But yes, it's still going.
Well, this local commission might be affected by.
It can be, yeah.
In
So yes, I mean that is, but it has. In Turkish case, even before Erdogan, that has been an issue. I mean, certain topics, certain things, people didn't want to. Yeah. I just want to say, some of you are interested in Turkey. Some of you may know that Turkish Airlines now flies nonstop from here to Istanbul, which makes it very easy, 12 hours. But you get here you get on in the afternoon. You're there in the morning, so it's very nice. So keep that in mind.
Are there any other questions? Oh, we want to thank Resat so much for coming.
Thank you.
We have learned so much.
Thank you very much.